Chapter 1. The price of obedient daughters. Candles in the Voss manor had been burning since dusk. Alara counted them the way she counted everything that frightened her. Quietly, methodically, her fingers curled tight in her lap while the men in the parlor below argued about her future as though she were a parcel of land. 12 candles on the mantelpiece, 4 in the wall sconces, 1 guttering on the writing desk where her father had left the contract unsigned, though she suspected that particular hesitation was theater. Her father's hesitations always were. She was 23 years old, and she had already learned that the world had a very specific use for obedient daughters. Outside, the autumn city of Veldmore pressed close and dark against the manor windows. It was the kind of city that had never quite decided whether it belonged to the living or to something older. Crooked spires punching up through perpetual fog. Cobblestone streets that ran downhill toward the river like they were trying to escape. Gas lamps that flickered without wind. Alara had grown up believing the stories told about Veldmore were meant to keep children indoors at night. Now she was less certain. The man her father intended to sell her to was named Aldrich Crane. She had met him once, 3 weeks prior, at a supper she hadn't been asked to attend so much as displayed at standing at the foot of the table in the green silk dress her stepmother had selected, answering questions in measured syllables while Crane watched her from beneath heavy brows with the patient, acquisitive gaze of a collector appraising a piece he'd already decided to purchase. He was 54. He owned the eastern textile districts. He had buried 2 wives, and the rumor that circulated in the powder rooms and drawing rooms of Veldmore's merchant class was that he had not mourned either of them particularly long. What her father owed Crane, Alara did not know precisely. What she understood was the arithmetic of it. Debt on one side of the scale, a daughter on the other. She heard the parlor door open below. Voices. Her stepmother's artificial laugh, high and bright as a coin dropped on marble. It's done. Then, Alara rose from the window seat and moved to the writing desk. And for one absurd moment she considered the letter opener lying beside the inkwell, not as a weapon against anyone but herself, which frightened her enough that she stepped back from it, pressing her spine against the cold plaster wall and breathing. Just breathing. She had survived her mother's death at 11. She had survived her father's remarriage. The systematic erasure of everything soft and particular about her. 3 years of being reshaped into a useful, agreeable creature, with excellent posture and no inconvenient opinions. She would not give Aldrich Crane the dignity of her breaking. The decision she made in that moment was not brave. It was simply the last option remaining to her. She would leave, tonight, before the ink dried and the contract became a cage. With her name on the lock, she made it for streets before the fog swallowed her. Alara had taken what she could carry: a small leather case, the garnet brooch that had been her mother's, what remained of the household pin money she'd been quietly saving for 8 months. She wore her plainest dress and her walking boots, and she had a plan. After a fashion, the coach station on Mercer Street, the night route to her mother's sister in the valley town of Ashcroft, 60 miles east, and blessedly outside Crane's territorial interests. The fog, however, had other ideas. Veldmore's fog was not a weather event. It was a presence thick as wool, tasting of river water and old iron, reducing the gas lamps to smeared orange halos every 20 feet. Alara had been walking quickly, her head down, navigating by memory, when she turned onto what she believed was Carrow Lane and found, instead, a passage she did not recognize, narrow, slick-bricked, the sound of the city dropping away behind her as though a door had shut. She stopped walking. The silence was the wrong kind, not empty, held. The difference between a room no one occupied and a room where someone was very deliberately not moving. You're going the wrong direction. The voice came from above her and to the left. Which was wrong? There was nothing to the left but a sheer brick wall rising 3 stories to a row of shuttered windows. Alara turned slowly because some animal part of her already understood that sudden movement would be a mistake. He was standing on the wall. Not pressed against it, not climbing it, standing on it, 1 foot braced on the vertical surface at an angle that should have sent him plummeting, his long coat hanging undisturbed by gravity, his face half carved by shadow. He was watching her the way the fog watched everything in Veldmore, with patience, with a quality of attention that had nothing hurried in it. She should have screamed. She opened her mouth too, and what came out instead was, "How are you doing that?" A pause. Something shifted in his expression, not quite surprise, but adjacent to it, as though he'd expected a different response and found hers unexpectedly inconvenient to catalog. "You are being followed," he said, instead of answering. "3 men, 40 seconds behind you. They are employed by a person whose name I suspect you know, Crane, of course." Of course he would send men before the ink was even dry. Alara looked back down the passage. Heard, now that she was listening for it, the sound of boots on cobblestone growing louder. She looked back up at the figure on the wall. He had not moved. His eyes caught the distant lamplight in a way that eyes should not. A faint cold luminescence, like light reflected off deep water. "And you?" she asked, because her voice had apparently decided to operate independently of her survival instincts. "Who do you work for?" He stepped off the wall. He landed without sound, without impact. 8 feet of open air, and he simply arrived on the cobblestones in front of her, close enough that she could see the clean, severe lines of his face, the kind of face that looked as though it had been assembled for intimidation and had been performing the function for a very long time. "At this particular moment," he said quietly, "myself." Then the men came around the corner, and everything happened at once. Chapter 2. What the daylight doesn't reach did not see what he did to the 3 men. That was the part Alara would return to later. In the dark, when sleep refused her and her mind kept replaying the alley like a stage production with crucial scenes cut from the script. One moment, the men were there, large, purposeful, carrying the particular silence of people paid to handle problems quietly. The next moment there was a sound she could not describe except as pressure, the way the air felt before a lightning strike. And then there was only the fog and the cobblestones, and the man standing with his back to her, still as carved stone, his coat settling around him like a closing wing. "Are they?" she started. "Unconscious." He turned. His expression had not changed. "I don't kill men for doing their employer's arithmetic. It rarely accomplishes anything permanent." Alara looked at the crumpled shapes in the shadows. Her chest did something complicated. Relief and horror braided together so tightly she couldn't separate them. "We need to move," he said. "There will be others. I don't know you." No, he looked at her with those wrong, luminous eyes. "But you know what is behind you. Come." She followed him. She would examine that decision later too, turning it over like a stone to see what lived underneath, whether it had been stupidity or instinct or something she didn't have a word for yet. At the time, it felt less like a choice than a current. The fog and the dark and the sound of distant footsteps pressing her forward through streets that grew older and narrower the further he led her, until the cobblestones gave way to bare stone and the buildings pressed together overhead, nearly touching. And the city smelled of river moss and centuries. He stopped at a door. It was set into an archway of old black stone. Unremarkable, the kind of door a city accumulated, the way it accumulated everything else, without intention. Without anyone quite remembering who had put it there. He pressed 2 fingers flat against the wood, and something clicked, low and resonant, like a mechanism rather than a lock. "Inside," he said, "I would like your name first." Another pause. He seemed to collect these pauses deliberately, the way other men collected their thoughts or their patience. "Calum," he said. "That is the name I use at present." At present. She filed that alongside the wall standing, and the lightless eyes, and moved inside. Before her remaining courage could reconsider, the space beyond, the door was not what she expected. She had braced for a dungeon, stone and chains, and the aesthetic of menace, appropriate to the evening she was having. What she found instead was a kind of stillness. A long, low room with vaulted ceilings, lit by iron candle stands that held dozens of tapers each. Their light amber and warm, against walls lined with shelves of books so old the leather spines had gone the color of dried earth. A fireplace the size of a doorway, burning without anyone having tended it. Furniture that looked like it had been chosen for quality rather than comfort. Everything dark wood and worn velvet, functional and severe and somehow deeply, unexpectedly inhabited. Alara set her leather case down on the flagstone floor and turned. Calum stood near the door. And for the first time, in the better light, she saw what she had not seen in the alley, a tear in his coat at the left shoulder, dark and wet. He held himself with the absolute control of someone concentrating, very hard on not revealing something. "You're injured," she said. "It is of no consequence. It's bleeding. It will stop." He moved toward the fireplace. and the movement cost him something, barely perceptible. A fractional tightening around his eyes that she suspected was the most expression she would be permitted to witness. You will stay here tonight. Crane's men will not find this place. In the morning I will arrange passage to wherever you are going. How do you know I'm going anywhere? You have a travel case in the face of someone who has already said their farewells to themselves. He said it without cruelty. Simply, as fact. Sit. The fire will warm you. She sat, because her legs had been making a compelling argument for it since the alley. She watched him move to a low cabinet and open it, remove a cloth, press it against his shoulder with practiced efficiency. The firelight painted him in amber and shadow the sharp architecture of his face, the dark fall of his hair, the way he stood as though he had learned long ago to occupy space without apology. What are you? She asked. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Something old, he said finally. Something that should have remained where it was tonight, and chose otherwise. He looked at her across the room, and his expression carried something she couldn't name. Not warmth, not quite, but an awareness of her that was different from Crane's assessment, different from every calculating gaze she'd been measured by. He looked at her the way one looks at something genuinely unexpected. You asked me a question in the alley. How I stood on the wall. You never answered. No, he closed the cabinet. I didn't. He lowered himself into the chair across the fire from her with the careful grace of someone managing pain. Sleep, Miss Alara, she said. Alara Voss, Miss Voss, you are safe here. That is all I can offer you tonight. And it is, I recognize, a strange gift from a stranger. The firelight moved across his face. But it is genuine. She should not have believed him. She had spent 23 years learning that gifts from men came with architecture. She couldn't see until it had already closed around her. She believed him anyway. She pulled her coat tighter and watched the fire burn. And across the room, Calum sat very still in his chair, with his injured shoulder held carefully, and his ancient, luminous eyes open in the dark, watching the door. Neither of them slept. Chapter 3. The things that are wrong about Himmering came to the underground room the way it came to everything in Veldmore, reluctantly, and without much conviction. Alara knew it was morning only because her body told her so. The particular heaviness behind her eyes that followed a sleepless night, the cold that had crept through the warmth of the fire somewhere in the small hours and settled into her bones. The candles had burned low. The fire had reduced itself to embers. She was still in the chair, her coat pulled around her shoulders, her leather case at her feet like a faithful, useless dog. Calum was gone. She sat forward, immediately awake in the sharp way of people whose instincts had been trained by years of needing to know where the danger was before it announced itself. The chair across the fire was empty. The room was the same, the books, the vaulted ceiling, the door through which she'd entered still closed and solid in its archway. Then she heard it. The slow, controlled rhythm of breathing. From behind her, she turned. There was a second room she hadn't seen in the dark, separated from the first by a heavy curtain of charcoal wool. It had been pulled almost shut. Through the gap she could see a narrow bed and the shape of him on it, fully clothed, boots still on, lying on his back, with his arms at his sides, in a posture so deliberate and so still that it looked less like sleep than like a man who had made a careful study of what sleeping looked like and was approximating it from memory. She watched him for a long moment. His chest moved, barely. She counted the intervals. One breath every 12 seconds. She turned back to the fire and fed it carefully from the stack of split wood beside the hearth, then set about finding water for the kettle she'd spotted on a shelf near the cabinet. It was a domestic thing to do under the circumstances, and she was aware that her domesticity was a coping mechanism. Her stepmother had installed it efficiently. The reflex to organize and manage and make herself useful before anyone could accuse her of being a burden. She recognized it for what it was and did it anyway. Because the alternative was sitting in the silence, thinking about Aldrich Crane and her father and the contract that by now surely bore both their signatures. By the time the kettle boiled, she had also taken inventory. The books were old, not antique in the careful, preserved way of collectors, but old in the way of objects that had simply been continuously used for a very long time. Several were in languages she recognized: French, Latin, the cramped printed German of several centuries past. Several more were in alphabets she had never encountered. She touched the spine of one, and the leather was so worn that the title had long since vanished. The cabinet she had watched him open the night before was unlocked. She opened it with the justification that she was in an unknown location with an unknown man, and that information was the only currency she had. Inside, the cloth he'd used on his shoulder, dark and stiff with dried blood, vials of something amber, sealed with wax, a folded document in that same unrecognized alphabet, and a small, stoppered glass bottle containing what appeared to be blood, human red. Deep and settled, that was clearly neither decoration nor accident. She closed the cabinet. She sat with her tea and thought about breathing intervals and walls and bottles of blood. And by the time she heard the curtain move, she had assembled herself into something resembling composure. Calum emerged in the state of a man who had slept in his clothes, which on him managed to look less disheveled than simply unchanged. As though disorder had assessed him and decided against it, he stopped when he saw her, registered the kettle, the tended fire, her face. You stayed, he said. You said morning. It's morning. She paused. You sleep like a body at a viewing. Something moved through his expression. I'll take that as observation rather than complaint. It's both. She set down her cup. How is your shoulder? He rotated it, the tear in his coat still there, but when he drew the fabric aside, the skin beneath was unmarked. No wound, no bruising, nothing, clean, as though it had never happened. Alara looked at him steadily. I see. Miss Voss, you were bleeding. I watched you manage it. That was 8 hours ago. She kept her voice level by considerable effort. Normal men do not heal like that. No, he said. They don't, and they don't stand on vertical walls. No, or knock 3 grown men unconscious without appearing to touch them. That last one is technique rather than. He stopped. Looked at her. The morning quiet sat between them. You are not frightened. I am extremely frightened, she corrected. I'm choosing to be curious instead. It seems more productive. She stood, smoothing her skirt with the automatic gesture of a woman who had learned that appearing composed was most of the battle. I also found the cabinet. I didn't touch anything. I want you to understand I'm not making assumptions, but I would like, when you decide I've earned it, a true answer. The silence stretched. Calum looked at her with that quality of attention she was beginning to recognize, the kind that suggested he was processing not just her words but something underneath them. A layer she hadn't offered deliberately. You should go to Ashcroft, he said. Today, I can arrange the coach, and if Crane has men watching the station, I will deal with them. The way you dealt with the ones last night? She tilted her head. How many men can you deal with, Calum, before it becomes a problem that follows me to Ashcroft? He had no answer for that. She could see him not having it, the rare stillness of a man encountering an obstacle he hadn't mapped. Teach me what I'm dealing with, she said quietly. Then I'll decide where to go. He looked at her for a long time. The embers shifted in the grate. Somewhere above them, the city of Veldmore went about its mourning. You will wish, he said finally, that you had left when I gave you the chance. Probably, Alara agreed. Tell me anyway. Chapter 4. The grief he keeps like a kept watch told her in the way of someone who had not spoken certain things aloud in a very long time, not all at once, not cleanly. It came out in pieces, the way old structures gave way, a crack here, a fragment there, nothing catastrophic, just the slow patient work of pressure applied over hours. Alara did not rush him. She had learned early that the most useful thing a woman, in a room full of closed doors, could do was make herself quiet enough that people forgot she was listening. Calum sat in the chair across the dead fire and spoke toward the middle distance, and she sat opposite and listened. He was old. That much she had already assembled, but the number when it came still moved through her like cold water through a cracked wall. 640 years. Give or take a decade in either direction, as he said it, with the faint detachment of a man who had stopped counting with precision somewhere around the 3rd century. You stop, he said, when it stops mattering. Counting? Grieving. He looked at his hands folded in his lap. You lose people, many people, over that span of time. If you mourned each one at full depth, you would drown in it before the 2nd century. So you learn to grieve in smaller measures. A pause. And then one day you realize you have become very efficient at it. And that efficiency is its own kind of loss. Alara said nothing. The fire needed feeding, and she fed it, because doing something with her hands made it easier to receive difficult things without showing the weight of receiving them. What do you eat? she asked, when the silence had stretched long enough. Not what you're imagining. He looked up. Then, there are laws. Old ones. Older than the houses that enforce them. Feeding without consent is the gravest violation a being of my kind can commit. It carries penalties that make your human courts look lenient. He said it without performance. No reassurance layered over it. No softening. Simply fact. I feed rarely. And never without agreement. The bottle in the cabinet. Willing donor. A physician who has known what I am for 30 years. He provides a small quantity on the first of each month in exchange for certain services I render his practice. Something crossed his face that might, in another man, have been called wry. He considers it a fair arrangement. So do I, and the amber vials? A tincture. For managing hunger between feedings. It dulls the edge. He paused. I mentioned these things not to make you comfortable, Miss Voss, but because you asked for truth, and I find I am unexpectedly inclined to give it to you. She looked at him. Why unexpectedly? He was quiet for a moment. Then, because in 6 centuries very few people have asked me questions instead of running from me. The ones who didn't run generally wanted something. Power, protection, immortality, which I cannot give in any case, and would refuse if I could. His eyes met hers across the fire. You appear to want only information. I find that unusual. And he seemed to search for the word restful. Alara almost smiled. Being asked questions is restful. Being asked honest questions by someone who does not want anything from the answers. Yes. She turned that over. Set it somewhere careful. Inside herself. The houses, she said. You mentioned them last night. Indirectly. The quality of his stillness changed. A degree or two colder. The way air changed before weather. There are 7 houses of the old blood in this country, he said. Governing bodies of a kind. They maintain order among our kind, adjudicate disputes, enforce the feeding laws. A pause. I belong to one. House Morn, one of the oldest, belonged. I was cast out 70 years ago. He said it with the precision of a man who had made peace with a scar without forgetting how it was made. I disagreed with my house's interpretation of the feeding laws. They were broadening their definitions, finding acceptable arguments for things that should have had no acceptable arguments. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I said so, at length, before the full night court, and they cast you out for it. They stripped my oaths, revoked my house name, and declared me a rogue. He held her gaze. Which means I have no house protection, no legal standing in their courts. Any vampire of any house can move against me without consequence. The fire popped. Alara absorbed this. So last night, she said slowly, the men Crane sent you were already outside, already watching that passage. Were you watching for someone else? Someone looking for you? The pause was answer enough. There's a house, he said carefully. House Vale. They have been interested in my whereabouts for some time. They use human intermediaries when it suits them. Men who deal in debts and acquisitions and consider themselves above ordinary scrutiny. He stopped. Alara felt it land. The architecture of it assembling slowly in her mind. She turned to look at him fully. Crane, she said. Aldrich Crane works for House Vale. Calum said nothing, which was its own answer. My father's debt, she said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. It was never just money, was it? They wanted a person inside that house. Someone to watch or carry messages, or she stopped. They were going to use me. I don't know the full scope of their intention. I know Crane is a conduit. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, and his voice dropped. Not to gentleness exactly, but to something careful. I know. I intervened last night because I was tracking one of Vale's men through that district and I found you instead. In the wrong alley, at the exact wrong moment, or the exact right one. He looked at her for a long moment. The fire settled between them. Your family sold you into something larger than debt, Miss Voss, he said quietly. And I am sorry for it. It was the sorry that undid her, not dramatically, not with tears, but in the precise way that genuine acknowledgement undoes the long, careful work of not being undone. She pressed her fingers together in her lap and breathed through it. Alara, she said. You can stop calling me Miss Voss. He inclined his head. Something in the set of his shoulders, she noticed, was fractionally less guarded than it had been an hour ago. Alara, he said, like he was learning the weight of it. Outside, Veldmore moved through its gray morning. Below it, in the candlelit room, Something cautious and new settled between two people who had both, in their separate ways, learned to expect very little from the world. It was not trust yet, but it was the ground trust grew in. Chapter 5. When the houses move, the city bleeds. She first sign came 3 days later, and it came in the form of a missing butcher. Alara had been staying in the underground room, what Calum called, without apparent irony, the quarters, while they worked out the geometry of her situation. Crane's men had returned to the alley twice, according to Calum, who moved through the city's upper world at night with the ease of water, finding its level. The coach station on Mercer Street was being watched. The road to Ashcroft had a problem at the eastern toll gate that had not been there the week prior. The cage, in other words, was still in place. It had simply been relocated from her father's manor to the fog-wrapped streets above them. She was not idle during those 3 days. Idleness, she had decided, was a luxury that people without problems could afford. She organized what she could organize, the living space, her thoughts, her questions, which she rationed carefully, spending them on things that mattered rather than things that merely frightened her. She read from Keelam's shelves, the texts she could parse, and asked him to translate the passages she could not. He did so without condescension, which she noted and appreciated more than she allowed herself to show. She was reading one such text on the evening of the 3rd day, when he returned from his nightly circuit of the streets, and she saw immediately that something had changed. He moved differently, more contained, the way a body moved when it was managing adrenaline, or whatever the immortal equivalent was. Tell me, she said, without looking up from the book. He hung his coat, took one of those deliberate pauses. There is a man named Gregor who runs a butcher stall on the Callow Street Market. He has sold me the monthly supply for 2 decades. He knows what I am. He has kept that knowledge quietly and without incident, because he is a pragmatic man who values the arrangement. She noted. You said is. His stall was empty today. His family says he left for work yesterday morning and did not return. Calum moved to the fire. His neighbor found his apron in the alley behind the market. There was blood on it that was not animal blood. Alara closed the book. Vale, she said, almost certainly. They are sending a message. He looked at her. To me, they have been watching my supply lines, which means they know approximately where I shelter. His expression was controlled, but something burned underneath it. Grief, she recognized now, having learned to read his particular frequencies. Grief and fury, tamped down to a cold, usable thing. Gregor has a daughter. She is 14. Do they have her? I don't know yet. He turned from the fire. But this is what House Vale does, Alara. They don't strike directly. It isn't elegant enough for them. They dismantle the perimeter first. The people around a target. The ordinary human lives that have the misfortune of existing near someone they want. She stood up. Then we need to find the daughter. He said, with an inflection she couldn't quite read. Do you have a better option? He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression. Frustration, she thought, and not at her. At the situation. At the architecture of it, which had just expanded significantly beyond the manageable. Sit down, he said, not unkindly. Let me explain what we're actually facing. He told her about House Vale, the way physicians delivered difficult diagnoses directly, without softening, because false comfort in such situations was a form of cruelty. Vale was the 2nd oldest house in the country, where House Morn, Keelam's former house, had built its power on scholarship and the careful accumulation of knowledge over centuries. Vale had built theirs on human territory, human infrastructure, the invisible architecture of debt and leverage, and carefully placed intermediaries who didn't always know who their real employer was. Crane was one of perhaps 40 such intermediaries operating inside Veldmore alone. They have been constructing this for 30 years, Calum said, buying debt, placing people, moving quietly through every layer of the city's merchant class. What they are building toward, he paused. There is an old law, the Compact of Veldmore. It was written 400 years ago, and it governs the terms under which vampire houses may operate in cities with concentrations of human population. It requires that any house seeking to establish dominance in a city must do so with the consent of an appointed human representative, a representative who can be manufactured, Alara said slowly. Someone already in debt to them. Someone who signs what they're told to sign. Yes, my father. The word fell between them like a stone into still water. Your father is one of several prominent citizens whose signatures Vale has been collecting, Calum said. When they have enough, they present the compact to the Night Court as a legitimate claim. The court validates it, and Vale becomes the sanctioned governing house of Veldmore. He held her gaze. At which point every feeding law, every protection currently in place for the city's human population, gets rewritten according to Vale's interpretation. The silence was absolute. How many people live in Veldmore? Elara asked. 300,000 approximately. She thought about that number. The weight of it. The scale of it. 300,000 lives running against the grinding logic of what House Vale was assembling. None of them knowing. None of them with any means of knowing. And you, she said. You were cast out for opposing exactly this kind of thing in House Morn. Yes, so you've been watching Vale. That's why you were in the district that night. You weren't just tracking one man. She looked at him. You've been building a case. I have been attempting to. His jaw tightened. Alone, without house standing or night court access, or any legal mechanism to present what I know. He looked at her steadily. And now they know I'm here. And they are demonstrating through Gregor what it costs to exist near me. Then we find the girl, Elara said, with a steadiness that surprised even herself. Tonight, and then you show me what you know about Vale, all of it, and we work out how to use it. Calum looked at her for a long time. You walked into an alley 4 days ago, he said, trying to escape one man. I'm aware, and now you are proposing to help bring down one of the oldest vampire houses in the country. Someone has to. She met his gaze. Unless you'd like to keep doing it alone. Outside, the fog pressed against the city. Somewhere above them, Veldmore's 300,000 souls went about their evening, unknowing. And in the candlelit room below it all, something that had begun as rescue shifted quietly into something larger, partnership, she thought. Or the beginning of it. Chapter 6. Blood Oaths and the Names of Old Curses. Thief found Gregor's daughter before midnight. She was unharmed, hidden in the grain cellar of a tavern 3 streets from the market, left there by a man she described only as tall and pale and very quiet, who had told her to stay until someone came for her. Elara suspected the instruction had carried the particular weight of a compulsion, which was a thing she was still assembling the vocabulary for. The girl was frightened and hungry, and 10 years older in the eyes than she had been yesterday morning. Elara sat with her while Calum spoke to the tavern keeper in low, rapid tones that resolved whatever the man's concerns were with impressive efficiency. They delivered the girl to a neighbor. Calum trusted a woman who asked no questions and closed her door with the practiced calm of someone who had learned that questions about certain nighttime visitors were an expense she preferred not to incur. On the walk back, Elara said, a compulsion. That's what keeps people quiet. That's what you used on the tavern keeper. A light one. Enough to smooth the transaction. Can you use it on me? He glanced at her sideways. No, because you choose not to, or because you can't. A pause that carried something heavier than his usual deliberate silences. Both, he said, and I will explain why, when we're inside. She had learned by then to read his pauses the way a sailor read weather, not for what they contained but for what shape they made in the air around them. This one had the quality of something long carried, something he had been deciding, for some time, whether to put down. He made tea, which she had come to understand, was his method of creating the structural conditions for a difficult conversation. Something to do with the hands, something to occupy the body, while the mind performed the harder work. He set her cup before her and remained standing, which was its own signal. When I said I was cast from House Morn, he began, I told you the simplified version. The version that describes the surface of it. He moved to the far end of the room, and she noticed not for the first time that he tended to create distance before revealing anything that cost him, as though proximity to another person made honesty more dangerous. The full account requires older vocabulary. I have time, she said. He looked at her. Then, with the air of a man stepping off a ledge he has stood at the edge of for 70 years, he said, I was not merely a member of House Morn. I was its oath-bound. She waited. Each house in the old structure had one, a vampire of sufficient age and power, who bound themselves to the house's principles through a blood oath, not metaphorical, not ceremonial, literal. The oath is written into the blood itself, into the marrow. It becomes constitutional. You cannot act in fundamental violation of the principles you swore to without consequence. What kind of consequence? Pain, he said simply. Debilitating. in its acute form. And over time, if the violations accumulate, deterioration. The blood oath was designed as an absolute guarantee of the oathbound's loyalty. It was considered the highest honor a vampire could receive. His mouth curved slightly, without warmth. I was 20 years old when I swore it. 20 years as a vampire, I mean. 140 years alive. And when House Morn changed their interpretation of the feeding laws, I began experiencing the consequences of resistance. He turned to face her fully. Every time I opposed them, formally or informally, the oath registered it as a violation. Because the oath was to the house, not to the principles the house had originally stood for. The distinction, which seemed philosophical when I swore it, became rather urgently practical. Alara set down her cup very carefully. It was punishing you for having integrity. It was operating precisely as designed. He said it without self-pity, which made it worse. When I spoke before the night court, when I laid out what Morn had become and called them to account publicly, the oath interpreted it as complete betrayal. The pain was he stopped. I was incapacitated for 3 days. When I recovered, I had been stripped. The oath dissolved with the house bond, which meant I was free of it. He paused, and utterly without standing. But the oath left something behind, Alara said slowly. She was watching his face. That's why you can't compel me. The oath wrote something into your blood, some principle about consent, and it stayed. His expression shifted. Something she hadn't seen before, which after 6 days she was beginning to think of as its own significant event. Something unguarded. You are very quick, he said. I've had good material to work with. She leaned forward. The oath is gone, but the principle remained. Consent cannot be overridden. Which is why you ask the physician. Why? Gregor was an arrangement, not a compulsion. Why she stopped as something else assembled itself. Why? You couldn't send me away. You could have compelled me to leave that first night. But you didn't. You couldn't. I could have tried, he said carefully. It would not have held. And I knew it. There are remnants of the old oath that function as a kind of permanent orientation. I cannot compel someone toward harm. I cannot feed without willing consent. I cannot use influence to override a person's genuine choice. He held her gaze. These are not rules I follow. They are things I am constitutionally incapable of violating. The oath rewrote me at the foundational level before it dissolved. The room was very quiet. House Vale knows this, Alara said. Yes. It is why they consider me ineffective. A rogue without standing, and without the willingness to use the full range of what I am. He looked at her. They are not entirely wrong. In purely tactical terms, I am limited. And yet you've spent 70 years building a case against them anyway. Yes, using only what you're willing to do. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. This ancient, bounded, principled, lonely man, standing in his candlelit room, carrying 6 centuries of loss and a self-imposed restriction that had cost him everything, and that he had clearly never once considered abandoning. That's not a limitation, she said quietly. That's the only thing about you that makes any of the rest of this make sense. He looked at her with that unguarded expression again, slightly longer this time. Like he was getting used to being seen and hadn't decided yet whether it was safe. The case I've built, he said finally. The evidence against Vale. I need to get it to the night court, but I have no standing to present it. He paused. A human citizen, however, does. Under the old compact provisions, any resident of Veldmore may petition the court directly. It is a protection written specifically to prevent what Vale is attempting. Alara understood, then, the full shape of it. Why the alley? Why all of it? You need me, she said. I did not plan it this way, he said. And she believed him, which was almost more significant than the plan itself. I know, she said. Tell me what the petition requires. Outside, Veldmore held its breath. And in the deep candlelit quiet, an ancient vampire and a mortal woman began, carefully, to build something neither of them had a proper word for yet. Chapter 7. What a human woman knows about Phyrethi came on the 7th night. And they came without announcement. That was the signature of House Vale. Calum had told her no theater, no warning, no courtesy of declared hostility. They moved like policy decisions, quietly, efficiently, with the confidence of an institution that had never needed to hurry because it had always, eventually, gotten what it wanted. Alara was at the desk, copying the petition documents in her cleanest hand. Calum had determined that a petition presented in the petitioner's own writing carried more legal weight under the old compact provisions than a transcribed copy when the Candles in the wall sconces went out simultaneously, not guttered, not flickered, extinguished as though the air itself had swallowed them. In the sudden dark, she heard Caleb say, very quietly, "Don't move." She didn't move. She did, however, close her hand around the letter opener on the desk, which she'd been keeping nearby for the past 3 days with a practicality she refused to be embarrassed about. The door came off its hinges without a sound. One moment it was solid in its archway. The next, it simply wasn't. And in the space where it had been stood 2 figures whose stillness was the calibrated stillness of hunters who had never had to rush. The one on the left was a woman, tall, white-haired, her face beautiful in the way of things that had been beautiful for so long that beauty had become simply a fact about them, like altitude or temperature. The one on the right was younger seeming, broader, with the flat, evaluative eyes of someone who had been sent to do a specific thing and was mentally rehearsing the efficiency of doing it. "Marin," Caleb said. To the woman, "Caleb." Her voice carried the inflection of old familiarity, which was somehow worse than hostility would have been. "You've made this complicated, which is unlike you. You are always the tidy one. You have been dismantling the lives of ordinary people to locate me." "That seems untidy. Proportional," she said. "You have something Vale needs removed. The rogue with the evidence file is a narrative problem we'd prefer to resolve quietly." Her eyes moved to Alara with the interest of someone noting an unexpected variable. "And you've collected a human. How unusual." The broader figure was already moving. Caleb was faster. What happened in the following seconds? Alara processed in fragments. The way the mind processed things that moved too quickly for narrative. A collision of motion and shadow. Caleb putting himself between her and the broader vampire with a force that sent both of them into the far wall, stone cracking with the impact. Marin watched it with the patience of someone who had deployed a distraction and was waiting for it to complete its function. She was looking at the desk. At the petition documents, Alara understood simultaneously. The evidence file Caleb kept in the locked chest under the bed. And the petition? The petition in Alara's own hand. That Marin had just identified as a legal instrument that could bring the entire Vale operation. Before the night court, Marin moved toward the desk. Alara did not run. She had run from the manor, from her father, from Crane. And the road running had opened, had led here. And here was apparently where she was meant to make a different choice. She grabbed the petition documents and the oil lamp from the desk in one motion. And she held the lamp over the papers. Marin stopped. "Glass-bodied lamp," Alara said, with a steadiness she had no reasonable right to. "Reservoir is full. The papers would catch before you could reach me, and you know it." She met the vampire's ageless eyes. "The petition is the only copy. I have the evidence file location memorized. If you take me, you get neither." The sounds of struggle from across the room had stopped. She did not look. She kept her eyes on Marin and her hands absolutely still. "You would burn your own petition," Marin said. "Not a question, an assessment. I would burn everything in this room before I let Vale have it." She let a beat pass. "I've had occasion recently to learn that some things are worth protecting at significant personal cost. I find I'm more capable of that than I'd previously assumed." Something moved in Marin's expression. Old, considering, and infuriatingly close to approval. "The human has a position," she said. "To no one in particular. The human has a name," Alara said. "And legal standing in this city under the compact. You're trying to corrupt. Which means if you harm me, you hand the night court a violation they cannot ignore." She tilted the lamp fractionally. "Walk away, Marin. Take your associate and walk away." And this becomes a story about a failed reconnaissance rather than an assault on a registered petitioner. The silence was the longest of Alara's life. Then Caleb was beside her. She didn't see him arrive. Simply became aware of his presence at her left shoulder, close and devastatingly still. And the broader vampire was not moving from the far wall. Marin looked between them. "You've taught her our laws," she said to Caleb. "She learned them herself," he said. "I simply provided the texts." Something passed over Marin's face. Assessment recalibrating into something more cautious. She looked at Alara one final time with the expression of someone updating a calculation they'd thought was settled. "Vale will not simply stop," she said. "I know," Alara said. "Neither will I." Marin left. The broader vampire followed without a word, which suggested either discipline or damage. And Alara found she didn't particularly care which. The moment they were gone, she set the lamp down on the desk with hands that had developed a significant tremor now that they were no longer required to be steady. She pressed both palms flat on the wood and breathed. Keelam's hand came to rest beside hers on the desk, not touching, barely an inch away. A gesture that was not quite comfort and was not quite distance, and occupied the precise charged territory between them that had been building for 7 days. You were magnificent, he said quietly. Not admiration. Something more careful than admiration. Something that had more weight. I was terrified, she said. I know. That's what made it magnificent. A pause. Alara. She turned to look at him, which meant turning toward the closeness of him, which meant being briefly and completely aware of everything that had accumulated between them in 7 days of candlelight and honesty and shared danger. His eyes held that rare, unguarded quality. His hand, she noticed, had moved the inch. His fingers rested over hers on the desk. Neither of them moved for a long moment. We should move the documents, she said finally. Somewhere they can't find them. Yes, he agreed. Neither of them moved immediately. The candles they'd relit after Marin's departure threw their shadows long and close together on the wall. Outside, Veldmore exhaled its fog into the dark. And somewhere above them, House Vale revised its assessment of the problem, which was no longer one rogue vampire with evidence and no standing. It was something considerably more complicated than that. Chapter 8. The architecture of Elmosthi moved that same night. Calum had a second location. Of course he did. Because a man who had spent 70 years as a rogue in a city that wanted him neutralized had learned to think in contingencies. It was further east, closer to the river, access through a passage that ran beneath a decommissioned textile warehouse and opened into a space that was both smaller and older than the quarters they'd left. Stone walls, a low ceiling that pressed with the weight of centuries. 2 narrow windows set at street level that admitted thin bars of gray morning light during the day and nothing at all at night. He carried the evidence chest. She carried the documents and her leather case, which had remained packed and ready since the first night, on the particular logic of someone who had learned not to unpack anything she wasn't certain she could leave behind. They did not speak much on the walkover. The silence between them was different from the earlier silences, not the comfortable working quiet of 2 people learning each other's frequencies, but something that had weight and direction, like weather moving in from a specific compass point. Alara was aware of it the way she was aware of the tremor that had not entirely left her hands, and she suspected both had the same source. He had touched her hand, she had not pulled away, neither of them had addressed it, which was its own kind of address. In the new quarters she reorganized the documents with methodical attention, while Calum examined the perimeter in whatever way he examined perimeters. She had stopped asking about the specifics of his security measures because the answers tended to involve sensory capabilities she couldn't verify, and found it more useful to simply register that he did them and they worked. When he returned, she was sitting on the floor against the wall with her knees drawn up and her head back against the stone, which was not a posture she would have permitted herself a week ago in front of anyone. It was the posture of exhaustion, unedited. He looked at her, sat down in the chair nearby, which put him close enough that she could see the fatigue in him too, the specific flatness around his eyes that she'd come to recognize as the equivalent, in a being that barely slept, of being deeply tired. The broad one, she said. Your associate stopped him. The damage to the wall suggested it wasn't easy. No, he said. Were you hurt? Functionally no, that's not the same as no. Pause. It will resolve. She looked at him. He was holding his right arm with a quality of careful stillness. She recognized from the first night the studied composure of someone managing pain and considering the management more important than the acknowledgement. She stood up, because there was something she could practically do, and doing practical things was how she managed the part of herself that was still processing. A woman with white hair and extinction-level patience, walking through a doorless archway toward everything she'd spent 8 days building. Let me see, she said. Alara, you let me see your shoulder on the first night. The principle is established. She held out her hand, which was steadier than she expected. Let me see. He looked at her hand for a moment. Then, with the deliberate quality of someone making a choice rather than simply complying, he extended his arm. The sleeve was torn above the elbow. The skin beneath was damaged in a way she was beginning to understand was significant for a being that healed as quickly as he did. A deep bruising that went beyond surface. Structural rather than cosmetic, the kind of damage that meant something powerful had applied force with intent. She touched the edge of it carefully. The way she'd handled the oil lamp with precision, with awareness of what she was holding. He went very still. You shielded me, she said. Not accusation. Inventory. You were behind me. You put yourself between me and him deliberately. She looked up from his arm. He was watching her with that unguarded expression that appeared more frequently now and lasted longer, which, she was aware, was its own form of accumulation. You could have moved faster without accounting for my position. It would have been more efficient. Efficiency is not always the correct metric, he said. No, she agreed. It isn't. She released his arm and sat back in her own chair, and they were briefly, precisely too close, and both aware of it. She watched him recalibrate the distance, and found, to her own surprise, a flicker of something that was not quite sadness and not quite frustration. The recognition of a space between what was and what, under different architecture, might have been. I need to say something, she said. That you may find inconvenient. You frequently do. I'm aware. She looked at the narrow bar of gray light from the street-level window, the pre-dawn quiet of the city pressing thin above them. What is accumulating between us? I notice it. I want to be honest about noticing it, because dishonesty about such things has a way of becoming its own damage. She paused, choosing each word with the care she'd given the petition. But I also know that I came into your life 8 days ago while running from one man who wanted to use me. And the next thing I did was walk into the middle of a centuries-old conflict between ancient houses. She looked at him. I don't want to make a decision about us while I'm still inside the emergency. The quiet stretched. That is, he said carefully, one of the more honest things anyone has said to me in 600 years. I'm not saying no, she said. I'm saying not yet. Not like this. She held his gaze. Do you understand the difference? Yes. He said it with an understanding that went deeper than agreement. The understanding of a man who knew better than most what it meant to have your agency overridden, who had built his entire remaining architecture around the principle that it should never happen, who had been waiting, she realized, for her to articulate exactly this boundary, and had been quietly afraid she wouldn't. The relief in him was not dramatic. It was the small, structural kind, a weight redistributed into something more sustainable. The petition, she said. We still need to get it to the night court. We do. And Vale will try again. They will. Then we have work to focus on. She looked at him across the small, ancient space, with its stone walls and its one guttering candle, and the thin gray light just beginning to strengthen above them. When it's over, when Veldmore is safe and I'm not making choices inside a siege, then we revisit it. When it's over, he said. An agreement, and something else underneath it. The quiet, careful thing that a being of 6 centuries permitted itself to feel toward the prospect of after. He rose and moved to the east window, watching the pre-dawn gray with his hands clasped behind his back. She watched him from her chair, the set of his shoulders, the careful architecture of a man learning, after centuries of solitude, how to hold something without gripping it. Outside, the city was turning from night to day. In it, House Vale was revising its plans. Somewhere, her father's signature sat on a document he didn't fully understand. Inside the small stone room, the work of before still remained. But there was, now, the shape of an after. And that, Alara thought, made all the difference. Chapter 9. What the old world forgot to keep quiet lasted for days, which Calum said meant Vale was repositioning. Alara said it meant they had time. And she intended to use it. The new quarters had a quality she hadn't expected and couldn't quite name at first. Something that revealed itself slowly, the way eyes adjusted to low light. It was the quality of a space that had been inhabited for a long time by only one person, and had organized itself around that singularity with complete, unconscious efficiency. One cup, one chair at the desk. The books, arranged not by subject or period, but by some internal logic, she suspected was chronological, the order in which he had acquired them. Perhaps which meant the shelves were also a kind of autobiography. She asked him about it on the second quiet evening, and he looked at the shelves for a moment as though seeing them through her observation. I hadn't considered it, he said. But yes, that one. He indicated a slim volume near the left end, spine cracked to powder at the corners. was given to me by a physician in Florence in 1492. He was one of the first humans who knew what I was and didn't attempt to either destroy me or exploit the information. What did he do instead? He asked me questions, medical ones, mostly. He was very interested in the physiology. Something almost warm moved through his expression. He gave me the book as a gesture of collegial respect, I think. He said I was the most interesting patient he'd never been able to help. Alara looked at the shelf differently after that. Not books, coordinates, the geography of 6 centuries mapped in leather and faded ink. Show me, she said. All of it. Everything the Night Court would need to understand. If I walk in as petitioner, not just the evidence against Vale, the whole structure. The houses, the laws, the court itself. She pulled her chair to the desk and found paper and her pen. If I'm going to stand in front of an institution that has existed for longer than most countries, I want to understand the ground I'm standing on. He looked at her with that expression. She'd catalogued under recalibrating the slight adjustment that happened when she did something that revised his working model of what was possible. Then he sat down beside her, and he began. The Night Court, she learned, convened once per lunar month in a location that shifted not arbitrarily, but according to an ancient rotation between 7 sites in and around Veldmore, each associated with one of the 7 houses. The sites were known to every vampire of standing and apparently to a small number of humans who had acquired the knowledge through various arrangements over the centuries. The court was presided over by the arbiter, a position held not by the oldest or the most powerful, but by the vampire who had committed the longest unbroken period of neutrality. Non-involvement in interhouse disputes, non-alignment with any faction, no blood oaths and no entanglements. Who is it now? Alara asked. A woman named Thessaly. She has maintained neutrality for 112 years. He paused. She is also the vampire who witnessed my oath to house Morn 400 years ago. She does not particularly like me. Will she accept the petition? She will be obligated to. The compact provisions don't require her personal approval. He looked at the documents. What they require is a petitioner who can be demonstrated to be a legitimate resident of Veldmore, acting freely and without coercion. Your presence must be visibly willing, which is why you couldn't have compelled me even if the oath remnants allowed it, Alara said. A compelled petitioner would void the petition. Yes, she wrote that down. She was building her own document alongside the formal petition, a set of notes in her cramped, quick hand that mapped the legal architecture she was preparing to navigate. Calum watched her work without comment for a while, and she had learned by now that his watching was not surveillance, but attention, the particular quality of interest that a being of great age paid to things that genuinely surprised it. Ask what you're thinking, she said. Without looking up, I was thinking, he said slowly, that you write the way you talk, precisely, with the minimum words required to carry the full weight of the thought. My stepmother considered it unfeminine. Your stepmother was wrong about many things. From what you've described, nearly everything. She set down her pen. What was it like? The first century, when the world was still new, I suppose, when you still had reference points. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might decline the question. Then he said, lonely mostly, but the loneliness had a different texture then. It felt like a condition rather than a choice, something that would eventually resolve. He looked at the Florence book on its shelf. It takes considerable time to understand that the particular loneliness of what I am is structural, built into the arithmetic. You outlast everyone who knows you fully, and eventually you stop allowing anyone close enough to know you fully. Because the calculus is simply too. He stopped. Too costly, she said. Yes, she looked at him. And yet here you are, allowing. He met her eyes. And yet here I am. The candlelight moved between them. Outside, the fog pressed its gray patience against the street-level windows, and the city went about its unknowing life above their heads. I want to tell you something, she said. Something I don't say with any agenda. I need you to hear it simply as true. She turned her chair toward him slightly. The person you are, the one who swore an oath to something worth swearing to, who spent 70 years working against an injustice by the only means his integrity allowed, who keeps one cup and one chair, because he genuinely stopped imagining another person might stay. She held his gaze. That person deserved better than 600 years of loss and one deliberately limited life in an underground room. The silence was absolute. He looked at her the way he had looked at the Florence book, as a coordinate, a point in the map of his long life that he was trying to locate correctly. You are the first person, he said, very quietly, who has said something like that to me without wanting something in return. I told you. No agenda. She picked up her pen. Now, tell me about the oath revocation procedure, because if Vale tries to argue your evidence was gathered without standing, I want to be prepared. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he straightened, and the closed, careful architecture of him had shifted by some small but structural degree. A door not thrown open but moved fractionally, enough to change what light came through. The revocation procedure, he said. Yes, it begins with what's called a blood accounting, she wrote. He talked. The candles shortened. Above them, Veldmore breathed its fog and its secrets into the autumn dark. And somewhere in the rotating geometry of the city's 7 old sites, the night court was preparing for its next convening, 3 days away. Calum estimated. Alara sharpened her pen and wrote faster. Chapter 10. On her own terms, night court convened in the catacombs beneath the old Meridian Bridge. Alara had not known there were catacombs beneath the Meridian Bridge. She suspected that was rather the point. Calum brought her through a passage that ran under the river's east bank. Low-ceilinged and ancient, the stone so old it had stopped being architecture and become geology. He carried the evidence chest. She carried the petition and her notes and the garnet brooch that had been her mother's, pinned at her collar not for sentiment, though sentiment was present, but because she had decided that the person who walked into the night court would be the complete version of herself. And that brooch was part of the inventory. They heard Vale before they saw them, 3 figures in the passage ahead, blocking the approach to the court's antechamber. Marin was among them, which Alara had expected. The other 2 were larger, older seeming, carrying the particular density of vampires of significant age, the way certain things became more themselves over time, concentrated into something harder and more elemental. The court will not receive a rogue, Marin said. Her voice was level cathedral stone. And it will not receive a human woman under his influence. She is not under my influence, Calum said. She is here freely. The compact, Marin said, requires the petitioner to arrive without coercion. It says nothing about arriving without attachment. Her gaze moved to Alara, assessing, looking for the seam to press. Alara had spent 8 days learning the laws. She had spent 23 years learning how to hold her ground when larger forces pressed against it. Article 7 of the Founding Compact, she said clearly, defines coercion as the application of compulsion, threat, or material duress. It does not define attachment as coercive. In fact, Article 12 specifically notes that human petitioners may be accompanied by counsel of any kind, including non-human counsel, provided the petitioner's voice is their own. She met Marin's ancient eyes. My voice is my own. It has been my own for 23 years, and it will remain so for however many more I'm given. Stand aside. One of the larger figures moved. Calum moved first. What followed was not elegant. It was not the choreographed conflict of stories. It was fast and brutal and conducted in near darkness. And Alara did the thing she had quietly decided she would do if it came to it. She took the evidence chest from where Calum had set it against the wall, tucked it under one arm, pressed the petition flat against her chest with the other, and walked forward through the chaos, with her eyes on the antechamber door ahead. Marin caught her arm. The grip was iron, ancient, absolute. You cannot present evidence that implicates 50 years of house operations, Marin said, very quietly, close to her ear. Do you understand what you're pulling on? The threads connect to half the institutions in this city. Judges, merchants, men with names. Your father would have removed his hat for. You will make enemies that will outlast you by centuries. Yes, Alara said. I know. Then why? She looked at the door. Because 300,000 people live in this city and none of them know what's being built over their heads. She pulled her arm free. Marin let her, which she noted, and walked through the antechamber door. The arbiter was exactly as Calum had described. A woman who had maintained neutrality for 112 years, which had given her expression the quality of deep, geologic patience. She sat at the head of a stone table, surrounded by representatives of 6 of the 7 houses, all of them older than anything Alara had any reference for, all of them looking at her with variations of the assessment she had been receiving from powerful people her entire life. The calculation of a woman's weight and finding it insufficient. She set the evidence chest on the stone table. She placed the petition beside it. She spoke for 11 minutes without stopping, which she had practiced in the underground room at the river, while Calum listened and corrected her legal terminology. She laid out the compact violations, the manufactured signatures, the human intermediaries, the plan to rewrite Veldmore's feeding protections from the inside. She cited articles. She named Crane. She named the toll gate. She named Gregor, the butcher, whose daughter was 14 years old and had spent a night in a grain cellar because she had the misfortune of existing near someone Vale wanted neutralized. She finished speaking. The room was silent. Thessaly, the arbiter, looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at the evidence chest. Article 31, Thessaly said. The petition is received. House Vale did not fall that night. Ancient institutions did not fall in nights. They subsided, slowly, under the accumulated weight of accountability, the way old structures eventually answered for the compromises made in their foundations. But the court's reception of the petition meant investigation. It meant the compact violations were now formally registered. It meant that what Vale had been constructing quietly for 30 years was now visible. Lit by the particular cold light of legal scrutiny, Crane disappeared from Veldmore within the week. Alara's father received a formal notice from the court that his signature on several documents was under review. She did not go to see him. She wrote him a letter instead, not angry, not forgiving, simply clear. The letter of a woman who had decided that clarity was more useful than either emotion. She did not sign it. Your daughter. She signed it, Alara Voss, on the first evening after the court's investigation formally opened. She found Calum at the street-level window of the East Quarters, watching Veldmore's lights come on one by one in the fog as the city moved from dusk into dark. She stood beside him and they watched it together. The particular, ordinary beauty of a city full of people who didn't know how close it had come. After, she said, he turned to look at her. You said once that you couldn't give immortality, that you would refuse if you could. She looked at him steadily. I'm not asking for it. What are you asking for? Time, she said. As much of it as we actually have. Without the emergency. Without the siege. She held his gaze. And I want it to be a partnership. Not a protection arrangement. Not a transaction. I make my own choices. I keep my own name. I walk into whatever comes next as myself. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, those are not conditions I find difficult. Good. She looked back at the city. Then stop keeping one cup. He made a sound low, barely there, the specific frequency of a man who had spent 600 years not laughing, deciding, cautiously, to reconsider. She felt it more than heard it, the small structural shift of an ancient solitude, adjusting, incrementally, toward something else. There is a market, he said, on Callow Street. Gregor has reopened his stall. A pause. He asked after you. Tell him I said good morning. She glanced at him sideways. Even if it's evening when you do. The city's lights multiplied below the fog. Somewhere in it, the night court's investigation was moving through its careful legal mechanisms. Somewhere in it, 300,000 people were sitting down to their suppers and their conversations and their ordinary, irreplaceable lives. Unknowing. Protected by documents. Filed in stone chambers and an 11-minute speech delivered by a woman with a travel case and a garnet brooch, and the useful habit of asking honest questions. Calum's hand found hers on the windowsill. Deliberate? This time, unhurried. She turned her palm up. Outside, Veldmore breathed its fog into the autumn dark, ancient and surviving, and lit from within, the way all the best things were.